Thank you, Miss Christie, for that. If you have your Bibles, I want you to turn two places, Esther 4, then also Esther 9. Esther chapter 4, Esther chapter 9. If you've never turned to the book of Esther, when you see Psalms, turn left and you'll come to it. And that'll be an easy way for you to find it. But then Esther chapter 4 and then Esther chapter 9. I'm going to start by reading Esther chapter 9, beginning in verse number 20, because this kind of sets the tone for where we're going as in this series on victim or victor, trusting God when the odds are against you. We've already revealed in the last two messages, this is the third message on Esther, and finishing up today with Esther, moving on to some other characters in our study. But we find that Esther has already demonstrated she is the victor. She and Mordecai were able to lead to a great victory for the Jews over Haman and the Amalekites, who had the desire to wipe out the Jews, a genocide through the whole Persian Empire. It was the largest empire in the world at that time. And so in verse number 20 of chapter 9, I'll read this to you down to verse number 22 so you see where we're going. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters unto all the Jews that were in all the provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, both nigh and far, to establish this among them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month of Adar, and the 15th day of the same yearly, as the days wherein the Jews rested from their what? Enemies, in the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to what? Joy, and from mourning into a what? A good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another, and gifts to the poor. Here we have the end result of what transpired in the book of Esther, a wonderful day of celebration. In this particular case, 2 days of celebration because of some things that were going on there. But it's known as the Feast of Purim, that is still practiced to this day amongst Jewish people, a day of rejoicing and joy over God delivering them from genocide under Haman's trickery that was revealed and brought to naught. And so that's kind of giving you the understanding of where we will be going. But back in Esther chapter number 4, beginning in verse number 13, Esther 4, beginning in verse number 13 down through verse number 16, this is the portion that we've been reading each week in order to set the tone for what's going on here. And so I'll have you turn there and just let me give you a few introductory notes as we look to this particular text. So we left off last week learning that Esther risked her life by presenting herself before King Ahasuerus to request the sparing of the Jews from Haman's attempt at genocide of the Jews from all of the Persian Empire. So the whole Persian, this wasn't just there where they were at in Shushan. This was going to be across the whole entire Persian Empire, which expanded that day from Libya, Africa, all the way through, I'm trying to remember how far it extended, but it was a massive, massive area that once Haman's decree went out with approval from the king, they put people on horses and camels and donkeys and sent messages everywhere around the known world at that time to tell them to kill the Jews. That's what was going on. That's what was behind this plot. And so what we find, though, is from last week's lesson, Haman's deep-seated hatred of the Jews was based on his victim mentality. And that victim mentality went back to his distant relative, King Agag, who was an Amalekite. And Haman was an Amalekite. And they had a deep-seated hatred to God's people, the Jews, and wanted to kill them. And so King Agag was killed by the prophet Samuel because King Saul refused to do so. And God punished Saul, limited his kingdom at that point because of his disobedience. And so Samuel came and killed Agag. But yet the Amalekites survived that battle. God knew they were going to come back to haunt the Israelites again someday. And here's where finally this was put to rest, 1,000 years later. Think about that. 1,000-year-long grudge. Actually, from Saul to this time, 500 years, but it was 1,000 years prior to that, where they killed the weakest Jews escaping from Egypt. And so we now look at Mordecai. Here's another man, Mordecai. He was the Jew, but he also had a victim mentality that caused him not to respect Haman, which again, you could understand the lack of respect for Haman. But Mordecai also disrespected Haman by not standing or bowing in honor of his royal position due to his victim mentality. As a Jew who knew that the Amalekites, that this Amalekite was related to those who attacked the Jews many, many years earlier. So both men, both different sides of the aisle, both had this victim mentality, did not want to respect each other. One wanted to wipe the other's whole family out, not only family, but all Jews. And so we understand that both these men had this victim mentality. So I don't want you to lose me on this, because Esther is brought in this story as one who now is married to the king. And she's in a position as a Jew that's not known yet that she is a Jew. And so she's in a very prominent position, but this law that was being passed would also affect her. The king could not go against his own commands. And so he's being deceived by Haman as well. So what we need to understand is that there is nothing wrong with being upset or angry when someone victimizes you. But as a Christian, one must be willing to let go of the offense in order to make reconciliation or to move on. And this is something I find is lost in Christianity today. People are not willing to reconcile. They're not willing to make things right with others. And they feel like it's the other person's responsibility. They feel like it's the other person, it's their fault, so they should. That's not what our Bible teaches. Matthew chapter 18, study it. Galatians chapter 6, study it. We can go on with different things. Matter of fact, Jesus says, if you do not forgive, guess what? Your Father in heaven will not forgive you. You say, but you don't know what they did to me. I hear you. I get it. There's two ways of looking at this idea of forgiveness. Forgiveness is setting aside what they deserve, as Jesus Christ has done for me and for you. He's done that for us. We don't deserve heaven. We don't deserve God's forgiveness. But He's willingly, because of love for us, to set aside what we really deserve if we ask Him for forgiveness. We're to have the same spirit towards those who may have horribly offended you. Now, that does not necessarily mean that you're going to build a relationship with that person again, depending on what the offense is. And if we study the Bible, we understand God had certain punishments for certain offenses that ended the necessity for that person being around still taunting you. So again, we can't get into all the different details, but we understand on typical things in daily life, you should be willing to offer forgiveness, and you should be willing to seek that, and you should be willing to grant that if that is the situation that you're in. Let me make a couple statements here before we get into our text. Victimization, which produces the victim mentality, can lead to, and there are many things, but let me give you three key things here. Number one, victimization or victim mentality can lead to this: anger and scheming. Anger and scheming. There are people who are, because of being victimized, hold that in, and then they start scheming and planning or start fantasizing on, I wish I could get that person back. And they actually vividly act it out in their brain, in their heart and their mind. And I get that. I was one of those, big time. If you offended me, I would offend you worse just to settle the fact. That was my mindset. That was my attitude. And God had to slowly tear that down in my life. But anger and scheming is part of the victim mentality. Victims seek revenge, not reconciliation. Victims will seek revenge, not reconciliation. Secondly, withdrawal and isolation. It's very common for victims to withdraw and isolate themselves. But with that, you must understand the mindset. The mindset is that victims will seek peace by avoidance, not seeking to restore. They'll avoid instead of seeking restoration. And this, again, is unbiblical. Now, if you're in an abusive relationship, I'm the first one to stand up next to you and say, yes, get out, get to safety, and let's see where it goes from there. Don't stay in an abusive situation. I'm not talking about physical abuse. I'm talking about in day-to-day conversations, day-to-day relationships. We understand there's going to be times for hurting, and there's going to be times for saying the wrong things, and again, on a lower scale, but it might even be some major things, whether it's a coworker, a church member, a friend, a family member, a neighbor. Victims often will seek peace. Now, this is the danger of people. God gave me peace about this. I like to tell those people, please stop. Stop with that. Well, I have peace now that I left my husband. I have peace now that I left my wife. I have peace now that I kicked my kids out. I have peace now that I left the church. I have peace now. Yeah, because you're not in the heat of the battle anymore. Of course you'd have peace there. That doesn't mean it's right. You avoid the situation. So yes, there's going to be peace. But that's not what God says. Seek peace and avoid everybody. He says, seek reconciliation and restore the relationship. Oh. Am I meddling? You're like, Pastor, move on. This is too personal. This is too sensitive. That's our Bible. God delights in restoration, not division. You won't grow spiritually. You say, oh, yes, I will. No, you won't. You may think you are, but you're not. And I know this has layers for different types of hurts, and I'm just dealing with maybe the lighter ones right now. But you still have a responsibility not to avoid, not to seek peace by avoiding everybody, because you will find peace. Oh, it's been so great since we've been separated. Oh, it's so great since we've been here or there. It's so great since we left home. It's so great since we left the church. So great since we left that office. Okay, yeah, sure. Why not? It's going to be peaceful. But you haven't fixed anything. And wait for the next person to offend you. So anger is scheming, withdrawal, isolation, diminished trust and unwillingness to truly love. Diminished trust and unwillingness to truly love. Listen, a lot of my pastoral counseling with marriages and relationships is past hurts, not even from the person they're with now. From a mom or a dad, from a guardian, from another relationship, boyfriend or girlfriend, from a previous spouse. And now that has been brought into the new relationship, and they went into that new relationship not healed, therefore not healed, not able to trust fully. And because they're not able to trust fully, it's a half-hearted relationship. They try, but they never can fully give themselves to that person. A diminished trust and unwillingness to truly love. Victims love conditionally, not unconditionally. We are taught by God to love unconditionally. That's hard. I'm telling you that as one. That is hard to love unconditionally. I get it. But we must learn to love unconditionally. Read 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And that whole chapter there speaks on the importance of love and what are the characteristics of true biblical love. That's not easy to live. That has to be God working that in you, out of you. All right, let's go on. The problem with Haman and Mordecai was that they both played the victim card, which resulted in envy, strife, fear, disruption, and death. I hope none of you would ever take it that far. But it's happened so many times. So many times. In our own, right now, going on. People will eventually get to the point where they'll break relationships and they'll even kill someone that they once loved because of their victim mentality. So let's talk about Esther's victorious behavior. And as I give you these two main points, I just wanted to give you these two main points so you understand what I'm talking about. It's going to be Esther's time on earth. I'll explain that in a minute. But in two relations. In relation to God's kingdom rule. And secondly, in relation to self-preservation. Again, we're talking about victim and victor. And so I want you to understand that. You'll see the points come up on the screen. But let's talk here first of all. In relation to God's kingdom rule, Esther chapter 4, verse number 14. Look there with me if you would. Esther 4:14. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from where? Here Mordecai went to Esther to say, please go to the king on our behalf, and if you choose not to, I believe God will bring us deliverance some other way. That was a mark of faith. He knew Genesis 12 in his heart and mind that God was not going to allow his people to be totally wiped out. They might go through suffering, but he knew that there's no way God was going to go back on his word. And he was bringing it to Esther saying, look, you have the opportunity to help. You can choose to, or you can choose to stay walled up, but listen, once they find out you're a Jew, Esther, you're dead too. And so Mordecai understood this about God. He understood that deliverance would arise somewhere because God had a promise and a plan for his people. The preservation of Esther and the Jews is a part of God's plan. God promised the Jews that they would multiply, that they would be his people, that they would inherit the promised land. So what is God's delay in setting up his final kingdom? As we look at this understanding of Esther's time on earth in relation to God's kingdom rule, you can either listen or turn with me to 2 Peter chapter number 2, 2 Peter chapter number 2, or excuse me, 2 Peter chapter number 3. And I just want to give you a couple points from here that I think are appropriate to our study, because we're talking about God's timing of things. We look at the book of Esther, and we understand that it was dropped in the middle of Ezra 6 and 7. This is kind of the time frame that Esther's story comes into play here. Persia Empire, the biggest empire in the world. We understand that here Esther, being a Jew, violated her own religious beliefs and her own practice and her own morality by going into the king's harem. This was something that Mordecai put her up there to do. And so we can talk about some of the bad decisions they made, but yet she's there for such a time as this. And this is the idea that I want to get across to you, is that there was a time that Esther was on the earth. And during her time that she was on the earth, she was in a position to act. She was in a position where perhaps she could have an influence. And so what it says here in 2 Peter chapter 3, I want you to notice something. The question that is in 2 Peter chapter 3 is, when is the end of the world going to come? When is God's rule kind of finally going to be set up over the whole earth in the sense of God's kingdom? And notice in chapter 3 and verse number 7, chapter 3 of 2 Peter and verse number 7, but the heavens and the earth, which are now, by the same word, are kept in store, reserved unto fire against what? The day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. But beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. Let me ask you a question. You ever thought, as you're going through life, and our life so short compared to already how much time has been spent on this earth, but ever going through things and you just wonder, okay, God, when are you coming back? When are you going to finally just get us all out of here and set up your kingdom? And when are you going to finally fulfill all the rest of the promises that are in the Bible for the Jews and then for the rest of those who are Christians? When's this all going to take place? Well, he never gives us a specific answer for that. But he calls us to attention in passages like this and others we can go to that, hey, with God, he doesn't see time the same way that we see time. He exists outside of time and inside of time. Explain that. I can't. I just know that I work on a time schedule. And over half my life is over already. I get that. But I must understand that in the time that God has put me on the earth, in the time that God put Esther on the earth, some big things were going on that shook up her world, did they not? Let me ask you a question. The time that God's allowed you to be born on this earth, let's do a little practice. Yell out the date, or you don't have to yell. Just say the date, the year that you were born real quick with me. I'll say mine, you guys say it. Ready? 1969. God purposed for you to be born then? Purpose for you to be born then. He purposed for you to be born. You're living in this time for a purpose. Esther was born in that time for a purpose. Now, you know what that does to me? Okay, God, what's my purpose? Well, pastor, you're called to be a pastor. If I wasn't a pastor, I would have either been in the Marines, I would have tried out for some crazy group to do something stupid with my life, and not saying the Marines or that kind of stuff. I would have been one of those guys who said, let me, charge something and die first, all right? That was just my mentality. God spared me from that. God called me a pastor. I was going to be a chaplain for the military, and I was persuaded not to do that, and so I studied to be a pastor. And here I've had the privilege of pastoring in 2 different churches next to military installations, and I love it. I serve my heroes, and I mean that sincerely. You men and you women, even if you're at home, you're what I wanted to do, but God called me to minister to you, and I love it. I love it. But what a blessing, because probably I'd be dead already. God spared me. God gave me a different direction in life. But for my time, if I wasn't a pastor, I would be involved with God's work somewhere, somehow, some way. Say, Lord, plug me in somewhere. Let me be used of you. Wouldn't matter if anyone knew my name or not. I would just say, put me in. We must understand, God's got you here for this time for a purpose. You might live 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, 80 years, maybe 100. What are you going to do with your life? Esther, by this statement in here, for such a time as this, when God looks at your life and he says, okay, what did you do with that time I gave you on the earth? What did you do for me with the time I gave you? Because you know what, guys? Someday we stand before God. He's going to have us give an accounting. You get that, right? For all eternity, you'll be reaping rewards based on how you live for Christ after salvation. We're not being judged with the unsaved. We're being judged on how we lived our life for Christ as saved people. What's that going to look like in heaven? I don't fully understand it, but that's what he says. Esther was in that particular time, in relation to God's kingdom rule, Esther was put there for a purpose. Number one, I want you to notice, she accepted her responsibility. Her responsibility was to save the souls of her people. Now, whether you say, well, God put her for that or God used her for that, doesn't matter how you want to say it, she finally got the message and she got involved to help out in that cause. As Mordecai said, Esther, if you don't do this, I know God will bring deliverance from somewhere else. But Esther, this is your chance. God might use you to bring deliverance to the whole nation of Israel. How awesome would it be for that to be a part of your life? Awesome. What a privilege. What a blessing. She was able to be it, and we still read about her. We lift her up as a woman back in the Old Testament that took a stand, that risked her life and say, woo, thank you, Esther. What a great story of victory. Well, you could have the same story today. You say, well, I'm not going to marry a king. No, but in other ways, raising your kids to glorify God, honoring your morality and who you are as a person, being a witness at work, being involved in God's work right now, that is the way that you can be victorious. Because we have so many Christians who have walked away. We have so many people who are not willing to follow Christ. Be the ones that make the difference in your little area. The ball teams, the office place, the church, go on, your neighborhood. You could be making a difference in many, many different places. She accepted her responsibility. Her responsibility was to save souls of the people. Our responsibility, likewise. You know what our responsibility is as Christians? To save souls of people. So you ask yourself, Christian, if God put you on this earth at this time, 2019, what are you doing? How are you involved in His work to save souls? And we're not saving the souls. We're presenting the message. We're helping them grow. But what are you doing? This is our time. This is our time. This is our time to be used of God, like Esther was used of God. Secondly, she asked for help from those who shared the burden. Verse number 16, if you turn with me to verse number 16 of back in our Esther chapter 4. She shared the burden with those who shared the burden with her. Esther chapter 4, verse number 16, go and gather and tell all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, neither eat nor drink 3 days or night, day or night, and I also my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. She asked others, please pray with me. Matter of fact, more than just pray, would you fast with me? Fasting is a way for you to show God that you're sincere. Fasting is a way for you to be totally dedicated. When you feel those hunger pains and you give up eating and you find yourself somewhere praying and saying, God, we need you to work in this particular manner, that gets God's attention. When you give up the pleasures of earth that come to you so easily and you say, God, I'm going to set aside the pleasures of this earth and I'm going to dedicate a day, or I'm going to dedicate 2 days or 3 days or 7 days. Some in the Bible went more days than that. God, we're not going to stop praying until we get an answer from you. That somehow moves God to action. Not that you're putting him in a corner, because it still has to be according to God's will. But it seems that if it's according to God's will and you pray that way, God moves. And this is a wonderful picture of that. She asked help from those who shared the burden. Who else should share the burden of reaching souls with Jesus Christ than the collective church? Not just here, but every church there is around the world. We should all be involved in saying, how can I be of assistance, Lord? How do I organize with you to help more people come to faith in Jesus Christ? How do we rescue more souls from dying and going into an eternity without Christ? That should be a passion of ours. And that passion comes and goes because we don't really stay close to God. We get so caught up in the world and making money and entertainment. Look, I'm there with you. I get it. But once in a while, we just need a good reminder. This is a great reminder. She asked for help for those who share the burden. Look, the church needs your help. And I say the church, that's the people. That's not the building. Amen. We all need each other to encourage each other to keep going, to stay strong, to be a witness, to keep growing. We all need it. I need it. But it's a blessing that we can be a part of God's work in that capacity. Esther's time on earth in relation to God's kingdom rule, she accepted her responsibility. She asked for help from those who share her burden. Let me go back to 2 Peter chapter 3 real quick just to kind of give you the two main points I was mentioning there. Number one, in verses 7 and 8, God has an appointed time for his kingdom to be set up here on this earth. God has an appointed time. Verse number 7 says, but the heavens and the earth, which are now by the same word, are kept in store. Meaning, God's holding things off. What's he waiting for? What's he waiting for? Everyone would want to know what he's waiting for. Well, verse number 9 kind of gives us an indication. Check this out. Verse number 9, the long-suffering love of our God. Verse number 9, the Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should do what? Perish, but that all should come to what? Do you realize God is just waiting for that last person that he knows is going to get saved? And he says, okay, it's time. That might be somebody in this room today. There's nothing left for God to do based on his economy. You watch what's going on in Israel. That's what the end time is all about. You keep watching the news. Anytime they bring up Israel, pay attention. God's just waiting for the last soul in his economy, and he says, okay, it's time. That's kind of intimidating, but kind of awesome. Look at verse number 15. And account that the long-suffering of our Lord is what? Salvation. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse number 15. And account that the long-suffering of the Lord is salvation. Why is the long-suffering? Because he's waiting. He's giving more people the opportunity to be saved. But there's going to come a day where God says, I see the hearts of all humanity. No more people are going to accept me. It's done. Whew. That's a scary day. Not for us, but for your loved one, for your friends, for your coworkers, for your neighbors, for your kids. That's why we're supposed to be passionately letting people know, hey, we're not perfect by any means, but we have a perfect God that loves you, and he died for you. He was murdered for you so that you would have the opportunity to be saved. How awesome is our God to do that? And yet that last soul that gets saved, it's time. Everything that's in store is going to happen. She asked help from those who share her burden. Listen, we share the burden with missionaries. We share the burden with the overseers ministry, Trail Life ministry, our nursery ministry, our super church ministry, all the different ministries of our church. We share that burden to try to reach people with the gospel, but you also should be sharing the burden to reach the gospel with the people that are around you. Thirdly, she asked God for help through fasting and prayer. We already mentioned this in verse number 16. I won't read it again. But I want you to notice in Matthew chapter 6, verses 16 and 18, you can just jot it down. She asked God for help through fasting and prayer. Her request for fasting and prayer is what moved God. Our request for fasting and prayer moves God today. Listen, this church was born out of the heart of a guy that fasted and prayed in Southern California many years before this church ever started. My wife included. The building you're sitting in was through fasting and prayer. Not just me, many people who said they knew they'd never sit in the seats of this building. But they prayed and they fasted and they gave, they sacrificed. We can go on and on. People who have come to Christ For some of you, you fasted and prayed for a relative, a friend to get saved, and they came to Christ because of your prayers. And we go on and on and on with the list. Jasmine. I remember many days, not telling anybody, but fasting for Jasmine, Everett, and Lacey. I remember going there, I felt impressed one night just to go to the hospital and just all night long stay in a room and just pray. And just that, and they were doing it. Many of you were praying, so it's not just me, but I remember the next day she started taking the turn for the better. You know, God is moved when we take His word and just do what He asks us to do. He's moved with compassion. He knows we are incapable in our own strength. She asked God for help through fasting and prayer. Fourthly, she acted with courage. Back in Esther chapter 5, verse number 1, now it came to pass that on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house, and the king sat upon his royal throne, over against the gate of the house. And it was so that when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther his golden scepter and that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of his scepter. Then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther? And what is thy request? And it shall be even given thee to half of the kingdom. Here she risks her life. She knew presenting herself before the king by not being requested could mean death. Even for the wife of the king. We know what happened to Vashti. She said no to the king. All right, you're done. Let's have a beauty contest. Get me my next wife. That's just the way it was. She presented herself before the king, and the king could say, I don't want her here. Take her out. Get rid of her. As harsh as that is. Remember, we're talking about King Ahasuerus, who had guys go out and stab the water. Whip the water. The guy's not all there, okay? This is who she married. She was risking her life to present herself. But we recognize that she acted with courage. Her actions demonstrated faith and courage. Courage is not the absence of fear. You know that, right? Courage is doing something even though you're fearful, but you do it because you know it's the right thing to do. That's courage. Or many times as a Christian, you're going to have to take steps of faith. Courage, you're going to have to be a person of courage. And that means taking those steps of faith, even risking people's actions, attitudes, reactions. But for her, it was a risk of death. Our actions demonstrate our faith, our courage. But it's also one thing to fast and pray, but it's another thing to go. I like Chris's story about the overseer's ministry and feeling an impression in his heart through prayer to just to go knock on a few doors. Oh, and by the way, we've been trying to get on the Navy base Bible study for 10 years, having them say no to us over and over again. Nope, can't do it. Nope, can't do it. God impressed on our heart to pray about it. Then pressed on our heart to go out and knock on a couple doors, and third or fourth door he comes to, I work in the chaplain's office. Yes, and strike up a conversation with Ben Hare, a wonderful guy, serving the Lord now in Ohio. But while he was here for this time, got us in the doors because that man was praying and that man knocked on his door and that man opened up the opportunity. Now we're on the base for 7 years having Bible study. God can do it that way, folks. What's your job need? What are the needs that you have? Do you really want God to help you, or do you want to just figure it out on your own? Amen. God can do that kind of stuff. We've seen it many, many times. The decree by the king was not able to be overturned, but it could be added to. And that's exactly what they did. How was the decree added to? Instead of them just going in and being able to just commit genocide against the Jews with no defense, the king added to the decree that the Jews now were able to defend themselves. Not only defend themselves, but they found out others were against them, they could go after them. And I think the total was over 5,000 enemies of the Jews who were put to death. 500 in the king's own palace. Imagine that. Were put to death because they were enemies of the Jews. God opened up some amazing victories for the Jews because of the courage of this one young lady and man. So we see there, first of all, Esther's time on earth in relation to God's kingdom rule. God has a set time, but God is willing to use people in His plan And I would say to you and to me, get involved with God's plan, because we don't want to go to heaven empty-handed saying, well, I had a great life on earth, God. Thanks. How about, well, Lord, I didn't realize how many people were here because of me. I gave that person a tract at the store. I didn't even know they got saved. I taught that kid in Sunday school. How awesome. They grew up and they're ministering to others. They led more people to Christ. And when you start going through the stories of when you get involved with God's work, it's exponential. Giving to the Lord's work, giving to missionaries, and the exponential possibilities of you just being faithful to God. Lastly, Esther's time on earth, verses 13 and 16, again, in relation to self-preservation. I hate to say this because I don't want to be negative about Esther being a woman who is courageous, but the statement she makes in verse number 16, if I perish, I perish, that we have taken as a charge. If I perish, I perish, and we count it as a positive thing. She was saying in a negative way, well, if I perish, I guess I perish. This was, the way it's stated here was not a rally cry like we use it. And if I perish, I perish. Let's go get them, guys. She was saying, no, I'm probably going to die. So if I perish, remember me, put a nice gravestone, she tried her best. This was not this rally cry, come on, guys, follow me as we go to the king. This was, I'm scared to death, and I'm probably not going to make it. Thanks for pushing me, Mordecai. It wasn't the way that we take it, but yet it's become that rally cry. Because, listen, there's sometimes as a Christian, when people are putting you on the spot, people are forcing, I'm not saying be a fighter, I'm just saying you have to have that same mindset. Look, if I perish for the cause of Christ, I perish. I don't know if you saw in the news just lately, a guy running for the presidency, take away tax-exempt status for churches who don't line up with his moral standard. It's coming, folks. It's already going on in Canada. So the things I preach of the Bible will potentially cause our church to lose its tax-exempt status, and that's just going to be the start. When you start seeing these things happen in America, you know it's going fast. We must understand. Devil has many people and places to stir up trouble against God's work going forward. Don't let him use you. Even if you're a Christian, because it happens with Christians, they get their nose bent out of joint, they get a little upset about something, and they stir up trouble in the church, and they leave, and they bounce from church to church, they get more problems. Okay, you're going to stand before God someday, but you leave a wake of negativity. Don't do that. Honor God with your life. Be a positive person. Ezra's time on earth in relation to self-preservation, I say this because Ezra really was motivated out of self-preservation. Was she not? Mordecai said, Esther, you're a Jew. Once they find out, you're dead too. Oh, yeah, you're right. Well, if anyone has access to the king, I do. I mean, I've given my life to him. I've given my body to him. I've given everything to him. Maybe he'll be kind to me. If I perish, I perish. And so she stepped forward. That took a lot of courage, but she did it. But why is it that we are so motivated to act in our life in relation to God when our life, our health, finances, or something else is on the line? You ever notice that about yourself? Maybe not. Maybe I'm the only one. I get in tune with God quick when I have problems. I don't know about you. Thank you. We got at least two of us, but we need to have a prayer meeting together. We need to fast and pray for one another. Isn't it funny, though, that how bad things go on? Oh, Lord, help me. Good things going on? Well, I'm thankful. Have a good life. We really don't give God much time. And that self-preservation kicks in many of our lives. Esther's victorious spirit brought deliverance and security to the Jews. And I'm going to finish up with just 4 main points, but I want you to notice this. The establishment of the Feast of Purim, chapter 9, verse number 20 through 32. I won't go into the details there, but it was established. It's still practiced today with Jews around the world. The establishment of the Feast of Purim. It's kind of interesting that Haman, every day in Haman's court, there was a lot. Anybody familiar with lots? Casting lots? It was kind of like our modern day version of dice. Roll the die. They casted lots. It was typically a black side or a white side or just a white side. And if it landed on the certain side, then that was how you made your decisions. Let's cast the lot. It's said that Haman did that every day, whether or not when he was going to go to the king with his plan to kill the Jews. And he cast lots. It's called the Pur, P-U-R. Kind of interesting that the feast that Mordecai had is called Purim, the play on the word, and talking about a feast of rejoicing for the deliverance of God's people because of Haman's plot to kill them. So we established of the Feast of Purim. Let me give you several more thoughts about victors. We talked about victimization earlier. Let's talk about victors, include this, and we'll move on to another character in the upcoming weeks. Number one, I want you to see that victors are willing to take appropriate risks. Victors, not victims, victors are willing to take appropriate risks. Appropriate risks. That's coupled by prayer, fasting, good advice, taking appropriate risks when it comes to big decisions or comes to situations in life. Steps of faith are required in God's work. You understand that, right? Steps of faith are required. You know, for some of you that have trusted Christ your Savior, the next step of faith for you in some ways is getting baptized. There are some people that are fearful of getting up in front of others. They're fearful of getting baptized because it's like, oh, I'm saying no to all my family members of a different religious persuasion. And some people are fearful. That's a step of faith for them. Next step of faith is going through the classes to become a member of the church. Next step of faith is then getting involved serving somewhere. I'm so scared. I've never taught in a church. How could I help in a church? I've never even served in a church. Say, listen, can you walk? Can you say hi? Generally we'll train you for anything that requires a lot of work. But man, can you stack chairs? You can get involved with God's work immediately. But a lot of people, it's a fearful thing for them to even think they're associated with serving in the church. And we can go on and on with the list of things. But victors will take the appropriate risks. Steps of faith are just required in God's work. Giving, that's another thing. A lot of people are fearful of giving of their first, their gross income, 10% to the Lord. I can't do that. No way. All of us have been there. But once you do it, you'll be amazed at how God provides. Just be amazed. That's a test of faith for you. Victors, secondly, are willing to fast and pray for direction. Listen, when you just go on your own without thinking and praying to God, say, what should I pray for? Everything. Really? Yeah. Our Bible says that, a couple places. You should pray for everything. Pray about everything. Be in constant communion with God. Just, hey, Lord, what do you think about this? You'd be amazed. Sometimes he talks back. Not audibly. John, don't do that. You've had enough coffee today, John. No, he doesn't do it that way. But he'll put impressions on your heart. He'll put somebody in your path. He'll put a verse that you're like, oh my goodness, that's exactly what I needed today. There's so many ways that God can speak to you if you're paying attention. Victors are willing to fast and pray for direction. Victors are willing to seek and listen to good advice. Listen, if it's a major decision in your life, get some good advice. Now, there are many people that give you good advice, but make sure it's good and make sure it's spiritual. Esther and Mordecai spoke and counseled together before they made this decision. That was smart. It was also encouraging. Lastly, victors are willing to finish what they start. I won't take time, but in chapter number 8, the king came to Esther. Esther, is there anything else that you want, sweetie? Here's this precious princess's request, or queen's request. Yes, honey. I'd like for you to hang all the 10 sons of Haman publicly. Oh, okay. You are a woman after my own heart. Wow, King Ahasuerus. So that's what she asked. Read it. What was she doing? She was making a statement. She was making sure to all the Amalekites, as far as we know, this was the last of the Amalekites. And she made a public display. 10 of them hung. What they mean by hung, they actually believe they stuck posts through them and put them out for visual display because Ahasuerus did that often, just to make a statement. She asked for the 10 sons of Haman to be put that way who were already hung. You have to understand, this was a statement and it was also a vindication in the sense that God spared what could have been a genocide of the Jews. That's a pretty powerful request, but that's exactly what happened. So she finished what she started. As gruesome as that sounds, many Christians don't finish what they start, or they're half-hearted at their work for Christ, or they don't follow through. Hey, I've been there too. I've prayed for things that I thought were really important. A week goes by, I pray less. A week goes by, I pray less. Then I eventually stop praying for it. And once in a while I was like, man, God never answered that request. And I almost hear God saying, John, you stopped praying. I found that if my prayers involved other people, I need to pray and pray and pray until God either tells me no or it happens, because it takes a lot for God to move people. But we see here that victors are willing to finish what they start, and that applies to many areas. So what tests are you currently going through right now? What would a victor do compared to a victim in your situation? So what's your test? What are you going through? What would you do as a victor instead of acting as the victim? How would you handle it differently based on what we've instructed in the last 3 messages? Are you willing to trust God and practice biblical truth? Or are you going to escape hoping it won't come up again? What you need to understand is God is right here to guide you and comfort you through whatever you're going through, whatever your situation is. But trusting God when the odds are against you is not easy, but it is doable. But you must have the courage and be a victor like Esther. Father, thank you for your words. Thank you for the privilege of preaching the Bible and for being able to guide in this particular context. And I ask, Lord Jesus, that you would help all of us to seize the opportunity that you've given us this day, 2019, this life, no matter how long that might be, that you might use my life, you might use each individual in here, you use their life to be a victor, not a victim. And when we do go through those times, Lord, of victimization, we're going to be targets, and people are going to be mean to us, and people are going to mistreat us. But may we not shrink away. May we be a victor. May we remember these lessons and act in a way that brings you glory, that we just don't shrink away and do nothing for you ever again. So I ask, Lord Jesus, you please help each and every person that's in here to realize and see where they're at right now. And they would trust you during the difficult times, that you give them the courage they need to make the right decisions. With their heads bowed and eyes closed, just very quickly, how many of you would say, Pastor, I know that right now I've got some situations going on in my life that I need God's wisdom, and I need His direction. And I'm, with uplifted hand, asking God to do that in my life. Would you raise your hand and say yes? Oh, wow, many, many hands. God bless you. I'll be praying with you in just a moment. Perhaps you're in here and you say, Pastor, there's some things that I just won't let go of. I've been hurt. I'm the victim. And right now, I don't want to make it right. I'm not asking you to raise your hand, but listen, I was that way for a while. And I was the one who was hurting myself. The problem is you may get to a point where you like the anger. And when you start to like the anger and you say it's all on that person, that bitterness creeps in and you don't realize it's affecting other relationships that you have as well. Please don't go there. If you're there, please repent and ask God to change you. And the best way to change it is humble yourself, go to that person and say, I need to make this right with you. You may find an absolute loving, humble person, or you may find someone who is just content on just being mean to you. Well, you have your answer. But you can go away knowing you tried. You must trust God in those cases. And I can't get into all the different cases represented in this room, I'm sure, but are you willing to be the victor and go through it the right way? Or are you going to shrink away as the victim, hold on to hurts, keep living that way? Perhaps you're here this morning and say, Pastor, I do not know for sure if I die today, I go to heaven. I don't know. I've never made that decision, but I'm ready now to make that decision to trust Jesus Christ as my Savior. I know it's the right decision for me, and I'm ready to make that decision. Would you raise your hand as well and say, yes, would you pray for me? I want to trust Christ as my Savior. If that's a decision you want to make and you want some more input on that, please see me afterwards. I'll give you some materials to read. Father, I thank you for those who lifted their hands, for the different questions that I asked, and those who are hurting because they have been victimized. Lord, you know their case, I don't. You can heal where I cannot. You see exactly what they're going through, and I realize they may have deep-seated hurts that aren't going to go away, and there might be, in some cases, there's no chance of offering forgiveness. Would you give them liberty in that case to be able to walk in freedom? May their trust be in you. But Lord, for those who know that they can at least try to make it right with somebody or try to settle an issue, may you give them courage to do so. May they be willing to make the tough choices and to do what's right, even when it doesn't feel right. Lord, if we're going to be spiritual people and be led by your Spirit, then we must do it your way. Would you give us wisdom for this life? May you help us to get involved and serve with your work. May we glorify you in the time that you have given us, like you gave to Esther. Give us a purpose, which we know is reaching people with the gospel, serving in your church. Help our people to rally to that cause and serve faithfully while they're here. Well, thank you for what you'll do. In Jesus' precious name, amen. God bless you.